It is the afternoon of the 26th of January, 1945, in a frozen field near a village called Holtzwihr in the Alsace region of eastern France, and out of the tree line at the far edge of the snow, the German army is coming. 6 tanks grind forward across the white ground, their tracks throwing up sprays of frozen dirt, and behind them and around them come the infantry. Hundreds of them, in their winter gray, spreading out across the field in a broad line, walking through the snow toward a thin patch of American woods that is defended at this moment by almost no one. The American company that is supposed to be holding this ground has been bled down to a shadow of itself. And forward of the tree line, alone, standing in the open near a burning armored vehicle, is a single American officer with a field telephone in his hand. He does not look like much. He is small, slight, narrow-shouldered, so young in the face that men who meet him for the first time often mistake him for a boy who has lied his way into a uniform. He is, in fact, 19 years old. He weighs very little. He has been rejected earlier in his life by the Marines and by the paratroopers, turned away for being too small and too underweight to be of any use in a fight. And in the next hour, this slight, baby-faced, twice-rejected boy from a cotton field in Texas is going to climb up onto the deck of a burning tank destroyer that could explode beneath him at any second, take hold of its heavy machine gun, and entirely by himself hold off a reinforced German company, hundreds of enemy soldiers and their supporting armor, long enough to save what is left of his men and break the entire attack apart. By the time it is over, he will have killed or wounded around 50 Germans, called down artillery on positions so close to himself that the men on the other end of the phone will beg him to fall back, and stopped single-handedly a force that outnumbered him by more than 100 to 1. He will receive for it the Medal of Honor, the highest award his country can give. And he will finish the war as the most decorated American combat soldier of the entire Second World War. A boy who could not get the Marines to take him, holding in his own 2 hands every medal for valor the United States had to offer. If you are new here, stick around, because this is not just the story of one incredible afternoon. It is the story of how the smallest, poorest, most easily overlooked boy in the room became the bravest man in the Army, and of the long, hidden price he paid for it, a price that did not end when the shooting stopped. But before we put him on that burning tank destroyer, you have to understand where he came from, because the distance between where Audie Murphy started and where he ended up is almost impossible to believe. To understand the stand at Holtzwihr, you have to go all the way back to a dirt-poor cotton farm in Texas, and to a child who had almost nothing, and who was told again and again that he was too small to matter. Audie Leon Murphy was born in the summer of 1925 in the cotton country of northeastern Texas, into a family that was poor even by the hard standards of that time and place. He was one of a large family of children. His parents had a dozen sons and daughters, several of whom did not survive childhood, and they lived the brutal, hand-to-mouth life of sharecroppers, families who worked land they did not own and kept only a portion of what they grew. There was rarely enough of anything. Audie's father drifted in and out, and eventually abandoned the family altogether, leaving his mother to hold a house full of children together on almost nothing. Audie left school young, by some accounts around the 5th grade, to work in the fields and hunt for food to help feed his brothers and sisters. And it was that hunting, out of pure necessity, that gave him the one skill that would later stun the United States Army. When your family's next meal depends on whether you hit the rabbit, you learn very quickly not to miss. Audie Murphy became a deadly instinctive marksman before he was old enough to shave, not as a sport, but because a wasted bullet meant a hungry night. It is worth sitting with just how hard that childhood was, because it built the man. This was the tail end of the Great Depression in a part of the country that was poor, even in good times, and the Murphys were at the bottom of it. They moved from one rented shack to another as the work required. A family of many mouths and never enough food, the children working the cotton alongside the adults from the time they were big enough to drag a sack. Audie grew up knowing hunger as a constant companion, knowing that the difference between eating and not eating might come down to his own steadiness with an old rifle out in the fields at dawn. He learned patience, the ability to wait, motionless, for the right instant. He learned to control his breathing and his nerves so his hands would be still when it mattered. He learned to make one shot count because there was rarely a second one to spare. None of it looked like military training. All of it was. Then, when he was still a teenager, his mother died. and whatever thin cushion the boy had left in the world was gone. The family scattered. Some of the younger children had to be placed in an orphanage. Audie, barely more than a child himself, was on his own in a country that was, by then, at war. He wanted in. Like so many young men of his generation, Audie Murphy heard about the attack on Pearl Harbor and the war that followed, and he wanted to fight. But the war did not want him. He was too young, and he was, physically, unimpressive to the point of being disqualifying. He tried the Marines. They turned him away. Too short, too light. He tried the paratroopers, the elite airborne soldiers. They turned him away too. Everywhere he went, the answer was the same. You're too small. Come back when you're bigger, if you ever get bigger. He was a slight, undersized, baby-faced boy, and every recruiter who looked at him saw someone who did not belong in a war. Finally, the regular army took him, and even then, the story goes, he had to have his age adjusted on the paperwork to be old enough to enlist. And during his early training, he was so slight and so young-looking that his own instructors reportedly wanted to reassign him to a safe job in the rear, a cook or a clerk, anything but a rifleman. He refused. He had not fought his way past 2 rejections to peel potatoes. He insisted on the infantry. Picture the recruiter's problem, and you understand how completely the world misjudged him. In front of them stood a boy who looked about 16, slender to the point of frail, with a soft, open, almost childlike face. Nobody's idea of a warrior. Everything visible about him argued that he did not belong. He was, by the crude measures a recruiting station uses, height, weight, apparent age, a poor prospect for war. And every one of those measures was blind to the only things that actually mattered. The marksmanship forged in a decade of hungry mornings, the patience of a boy who had learned to wait motionless for a shot, and a depth of stubborn, quiet will that the eye simply cannot see. During training, he even passed out once from the heat during drill, which only deepened his instructor's conviction that this fragile-looking boy should be kept away from the front. They could not have been more wrong about anyone. The very body they saw as a liability contained one of the most naturally gifted and relentless combat soldiers the United States would produce in the entire war. He just had not been given the chance yet to show it. And here is where the story of the too small boy begins to turn into something the world had never seen, because on the battlefield, all the things that had made recruiters reject Audie Murphy stopped mattering. And the thing that hunting had given him, that lethal, patient, ice-cold marksmanship, combined with a kind of physical courage that seemed to have no bottom, turned out to be worth more than size or reach or a strong jaw. He was assigned to the 3rd Infantry Division, one of the hardest-used American divisions of the war, and he went into combat, and he simply did not stop. He fought in the invasion of Sicily. He fought up the brutal length of Italy, through the mountains and the mud and the endless grinding attrition of that campaign, and in the desperate fighting around the Anzio beachhead, where the Germans nearly drove the Allies back into the sea. Then he landed in southern France in the summer of 1944 and fought north and east through France toward Germany. Battle after battle, his reputation grew, not as a big, loud hero, but as a quiet, deadly, utterly reliable soldier who could always be counted on to do the impossible thing and somehow live through it. He earned decoration after decoration for valor. He was wounded more than once and kept coming back. Officers who lost track of everything else in the chaos of combat learned that if Audie Murphy was on the line would hold. What made his rise so remarkable was that it happened entirely on merit, in the one arena where merit is impossible to fake. There is no faking your way through sustained infantry combat. The men around you see exactly what you are made of, and they see it repeatedly over months in the worst conditions human beings can be placed in. And what Murphy's fellow soldiers saw again and again was a young man who did not break, who kept his head when others lost theirs, who could be counted on to hold when holding seemed impossible, and to advance when advancing seemed suicidal. He was promoted from the ranks and eventually given a battlefield commission as an officer, the Army's recognition that this once rejected boy was not only a superb soldier, but a leader men would follow. And they did follow him, in part because he never asked them to take a risk he would not take first and more fully himself. By the time he reached the frozen fields of Alsace in early 1945, he had already fought across 3 countries, been decorated many times over, been wounded and returned, and buried more friends than a boy his age should ever have to. He was still a teenager, He had already seen and done more war than most soldiers see in a lifetime, but the war took from him even as it made his legend, and one loss in particular tells you what kind of man he really was underneath the medals. In the fighting in southern France, Murphy had a close friend, a fellow soldier he was deeply attached to, one of the small band of men that combat makes closer than brothers. And that friend was killed, shot down by a German who, according to Murphy's account, had used a false show of surrender to lure the American in before opening fire. Something in Murphy broke and then hardened. In a cold fury, he went after the enemy position that had done it and wiped it out, using the very weapons of the men who had killed his friend against them. It was an act of such reckless, single-minded ferocity that it earned him one of the Army's highest decorations for valor. The details of that day say a great deal about the man he was becoming. When his friend fell to that treacherous ambush, Murphy did not take cover and wait, and he did not call for someone else to deal with it. Something in him went past fear entirely. He assaulted the enemy position alone, closed with it, and destroyed it. And then, still not finished, still burning with grief and rage, he pressed on and knocked out further enemy positions in the same area, single-handedly clearing ground that should have taken a squad. It was the same pattern that would define him at Holtzwihr and everywhere else. At the exact moment when most men freeze or fall back, Audie Murphy went forward, coldly and completely, as though the ordinary instinct for self-preservation had simply been switched off. But the engine underneath it was not bloodlust, it was loss. He fought hardest in the moments right after the war took someone he loved, as though he could answer the grief only by hurling himself at the thing that had caused it. But the medals were never really the point for Murphy. The point was the friend. Underneath the astonishing courage, there was a boy who had already lost almost everyone, his father, his mother, his childhood, and who now watched the war take the brothers he had found to replace them. That grief, carried quietly under the calm exterior, was as much a part of Audie Murphy as the marksmanship. Remember it because it is the other half of this story, the half that does not fit on a medal. By the beginning of 1945, this once-rejected boy was a battle-hardened officer, commissioned from the ranks, given responsibility beyond his years, and by January he was, at the age of 19, effectively commanding a rifle company. And his company was in a bad way. This was the fighting in the Colmar Pocket, a stubborn bulge of German-held ground in the Alsace region that the Allies were grinding down in the dead of a bitter winter. It was brutally cold, with deep snow and freezing temperatures that were an enemy all their own, killing and maiming men through frostbite and exposure as surely as any bullet. The Colmar Pocket was one of those places whose name means little to most people today, but that cost an enormous amount of blood to erase. As the Allies had swept across France in late 1944, the Germans had managed to hold on to a pocket of ground on the western side of the Rhine, around the city of Colmar in Alsace, a foothold that kept a German army in France when France was supposed to be free, and that had to be reduced yard by frozen yard. The winter of that campaign was savage. Men fought in snow that came up past their boots, in cold that froze the oil in weapons and the water in canteens, that turned the wounded into casualties who died of exposure before they could be reached, that took fingers and toes and feet from soldiers who never saw an enemy. The Germans in the pocket, though beaten in the larger war, fought hard because they were defending the doorstep of their own country. Every village in that flat, white, freezing landscape had to be taken, and Holtzwihr was one of them. It was into that grinding, frozen, unglamorous fight, the kind that produces no famous battles, only endless small horrors, that Audie Murphy's shattered company was fed. And the fighting had been savage. Murphy's company, which at full strength should have numbered well over 100 men, had been chewed down by casualties to a fraction of that. By the time of the events at Holtzwihr, he had only around 19 men left who were fit to fight. A company in name, a broken remnant in reality. And this exhausted handful of men, under their teenage commander, was ordered to hold a position at the edge of some woods near Holtzwihr, in the open, in the snow, and to expect a German counterattack. The counterattack came on the afternoon of the 26th of January, and it was exactly the nightmare a thin, worn-out company fears most. Massed enemy armor and infantry coming across open ground. 6 German tanks rolled out of the distant tree line, and with them advanced a strong force of German infantry, a couple of hundred men or more, a full reinforced company's worth of soldiers spreading across the snowfield toward Murphy's position. Against 6 tanks and hundreds of infantry, Murphy had 19 tired men, a couple of American tank destroyers in support, and himself. On any reasonable accounting, the position could not be held. The proper thing, the survivable thing, was to give it up. Murphy did not think like that, but he was not reckless with his men's lives either. This is the part people miss. His first decision was to save them. He ordered his handful of surviving soldiers to pull back into the prepared positions in the woods behind him, out of the direct path of the tanks, where they would have cover and could keep fighting without being overrun in the open. He would not spend their lives holding an untenable line in the snow. And then, having sent his men to safety, he did the thing that turned a competent officer into a legend. He stayed. He remained forward, alone, at the very edge of the enemy's advance, with a field telephone in his hand, because from that forward position he could see the German attack developing and could call down American artillery fire directly onto it. He made himself the eyes of the guns, standing exposed in the open while an army walked toward him, so that the shells would land where they would do the most good. The German advance came on. The 2 supporting American tank destroyers took the German tanks under fire, but the enemy armor was too much for them. One of the tank destroyers was hit, knocked out, and set ablaze. Its crew bailed out and scrambled clear as flames took hold of the vehicle. And it was that burning wreck, a disabled American tank destroyer, on fire, with its fuel and its stored ammunition cooking inside it and liable to detonate at any moment, that Audie Murphy now turned into the strangest fighting position of the entire war. He climbed up onto it. Understand what that meant. He climbed onto the deck of a burning armored vehicle. Beneath him and around him were the vehicle's own fuel and its remaining shells, heated by the fire, any one of which could have cooked off and blown him apart in an instant. Black smoke was pouring off the machine, and mounted on top of that burning wreck was a heavy machine gun, a .50 caliber, the big American gun, the kind that tears men and light vehicles to pieces. Murphy took hold of it, swung it toward the advancing German infantry, and opened fire. For the next hour, for about a solid hour, alone on top of a burning vehicle that should have killed him at any moment, Audie Murphy fought off the German attack single-handedly. He raked the advancing infantry with the heavy machine gun, cutting down the men coming across the snow, breaking up their formations, forcing them to ground, killing and wounding them by the score. Try to hold the full picture of it in your mind, because familiarity flattens how insane this was. A 19-year-old boy is standing on the engine deck of a burning tank destroyer. The vehicle is on fire beneath his feet. Inside it, cooking in the heat, are the rounds it carried and whatever fuel remains. And at any second, the whole thing can go up and take him with it. Every soldier around knows that a burning armored vehicle is a bomb on a timer, which is exactly why the crew abandoned it and why no sane man would climb aboard. He climbed aboard anyway because it was the only firing position with a weapon that could reach the enemy in the numbers that were coming. He is fully exposed, standing upright, silhouetted against the smoke, while hundreds of enemy soldiers advance across open ground with nothing else to shoot at but him. German infantry work toward the flanks of his position, trying to get an angle, and he swings the heavy gun to meet them and cuts them down. A German squad crawls close along a ditch, close enough to rush him, and he catches them and destroys them. All the while, his own vehicle burns hotter, and the smoke stings his eyes, and blood runs down his leg from where he has been hit, and he does not come down. He has decided, in some cold and total way, that he is not leaving that position until the attack is broken, and the possibility of his own death has simply been set aside as irrelevant to the task in front of him. When groups of Germans worked their way closer than any sane defender would allow, he cut them down. The smoke pouring off the burning tank destroyer partly hid him from the enemy, and in the confusion, the Germans could not tell how few men were actually opposing them. The volume of fire coming from that one burning wreck suggested a defended strongpoint, not a single teenage lieutenant standing on a bonfire. And the whole time he fired the machine gun, he never let go of the other weapon in his hand, the telephone. He kept directing the American artillery, calling the shells in closer and closer to his own position as the Germans pressed in, until the fire was falling almost on top of him. There is a moment from that hour that has become famous, and it captures the whole impossible scene better than any description could. The artillery officer on the other end of the telephone line, hearing Murphy calling the fire in dangerously close, asked him how near the Germans actually were to his position. And Murphy, standing on a burning tank destroyer with a company of enemy infantry closing in, is remembered as answering, more or less, "Hold the phone a moment, and I will let you talk to one of them." It is the kind of line that sounds invented, the kind of thing a screenwriter would put in a hero's mouth. But it came from a 19-year-old boy in the middle of the fight of his life, and it tells you exactly the strange, cold calm he fought with. He was not raging. He was almost matter-of-fact, working the gun and the phone like a man doing a difficult job while the world burned around him. He was wounded during the stand, hit in the leg, bleeding, in pain, and he kept fighting. The tank destroyer beneath him continued to burn and could have exploded at any second, and he kept fighting. His ammunition dwindled, and he kept fighting. And bit by bit, the impossible worked. The German attack, which had come on with such confidence across the snow, began to falter and break against the fire of one determined man and the artillery he was directing. Their infantry could not close. Their losses mounted. The momentum bled out of the assault, and eventually, battered and stalled, the Germans pulled back. A reinforced company and its tanks turned away from a position held at the decisive point by a single soldier on a burning wreck. Only then did Murphy climb down. Wounded, half out of ammunition, streaked with smoke, he made his way back to his men in the woods. And even then, he did not stop. Rather than simply collapsing to be treated, he organized his surviving handful of soldiers and led them forward in a counterattack to drive the shaken enemy further back and secure the position. He refused serious medical attention for his leg wound until the job was fully done. By any measure, he had already done the work of a dozen men. He kept going until the ground was firmly held, when the accounts of what Audie Murphy had done at Holtzwihr were gathered and confirmed. They read like fiction. A 19-year-old officer had ordered his men to safety, remained alone under a massed enemy attack, mounted a burning tank destroyer that could have exploded at any instant, held off a reinforced German company single-handed for around an hour, inflicted some 50 casualties on the enemy, directed artillery onto positions almost on top of himself, been wounded, and then led a counterattack and lived. For this, Audie Murphy was awarded the Medal of Honor, presented to him a few months later. But the Medal of Honor was only the crown of it. Across the whole span of his service, Sicily, Italy, Anzio, France, Germany, Murphy had accumulated an almost unbelievable number of decorations for valor. By the end, this boy the Marines had rejected as too small held the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, multiple Silver Stars, multiple Bronze Stars, multiple Purple Hearts for his wounds, and a long list of other American and foreign awards. Dozens of decorations in all. He became the most decorated American combat soldier of the Second World War. The smallest boy in the room had, in the most literal sense possible, ended up with every medal the room had to give. There is something almost dizzying about the scale of it when you lay it out. Think back to that recruiting station, to the boy the Marines waved off as too small and the paratroopers waved off as too small, the fragile-looking child his own instructors wanted to hide in a kitchen. Now, set beside that image, the man he became by the age of 19, holder of his nation's highest award for valor, and alongside it, a chest full of the next highest awards, several times over, plus wound decorations for the blood he had spilled, plus honors from the Allied nations whose soil he had helped to free. He had received, in a few short years of war, essentially the complete set of medals a fighting man could earn, a collection so extensive that it is easier to list what he did not win than what he did. And every single one of them had been earned the hard way, in front of witnesses, in the worst places on earth, by a boy the professionals had all agreed was too small to fight. When his country pinned the Medal of Honor on him, it was not honoring a lucky afternoon. It was, whether it fully understood this or not, admitting how completely it had misjudged what a soldier is and where courage actually lives. And you would think that would be the end of the story. The storybook ending, the too small boy who became the greatest hero, going home to a grateful nation. Part of that did happen. Audie Murphy came home a national hero. His face appeared on the cover of a major magazine. He wrote a memoir of his war, a spare and honest book called To Hell and Back, which became a huge bestseller. And in one of the strangest turns of all, Hollywood made a film of that memoir and cast Audie Murphy to play himself, the actual man reenacting his own war on screen for the cameras. He became a movie star, appearing in dozens of films over the following years, mostly westerns, trading on the very image of the quiet, deadly, honorable American fighting man that his real life had earned. The sharecropper's son, who had left school in the 5th grade to hunt rabbits for his hungry family, was now a famous face on movie screens across the country. It was, from the outside, a fairy tale, the poorest boy in Texas becoming a decorated hero, and then a Hollywood leading man. But the fairy tale had a hollow center, and Murphy knew it better than anyone. Acting was not really his gift the way soldiering had been. He made a long career of it through sheer persistence and the power of his story. But he was, by his own honest reckoning, playing a version of himself for a public that wanted the legend more than the man. He struggled with money, made and lost fortunes, gambled, chased business ventures that failed. And underneath the movie star surface, the real trouble never left. The famous face on the Western posters belonged to a man who often could not sleep, who kept a pistol close, who woke from nightmares of the snow and the fire, and the friends he had watched die. The distance between the smiling hero on the screen and the haunted veteran off it was enormous, and Murphy lived in that gap for the rest of his life. But there was another war going on, one that never made the magazine covers, and it is the part of Audie Murphy's story that matters most, because it is the part that was true not just of him, but of a whole generation of men who came home carrying wounds no one could see. Audie Murphy could not leave the war behind. For the rest of his life, he was haunted by it. He suffered from what we would today recognize clearly as post-traumatic stress. The nightmares, the insomnia, the inability to rest, the sudden rages, the sleeping with a loaded pistol within reach because some part of him never came home from the snow at Holtzwihr and all the fields like it. In an era when such things were still called battle fatigue and were treated with shame and silence, when men were expected to simply swallow what they had endured and never speak of it, Audie Murphy did something quietly courageous that had nothing to do with a machine gun. He spoke about it. He was open, publicly, about the psychological toll the war had taken on him, about the sleeplessness and the terrors, precisely because he wanted the country to understand that its returning soldiers, the ordinary ones, not just the famous one, were carrying these wounds and needed help, not judgment. The most decorated soldier of the war used his fame to tell the truth about its aftermath and to push for the wounded minds of veterans to be taken as seriously as their broken bodies. In its own way, that may have been the bravest thing he ever did. He did not get to grow old. In 1971, Audie Murphy died in the crash of a small aircraft in bad weather, still a relatively young man, decades of life stolen from him after he had survived everything the German army could throw at him. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery among the honored dead of the nation he had served, and his grave there is one of the most visited in the entire cemetery. Ordinary Americans, still, all these years later, coming to stand for a moment at the resting place of the too small boy who became the bravest man in the Army. His headstone, by his own wish, is plain. A simple government marker like the ones around it, refusing the grander monument his status could have commanded, as though even in death he insisted on standing with the ordinary soldiers rather than above them. That too was Audie Murphy. For all the medals and the movie fame, the thing he seemed to understand most clearly was that he was one of millions, that the courage the country celebrated in him had been shown unrecorded by countless men whose names no one would ever know, and that the wounds he carried home were carried home by a whole generation. He never lost that. The boy who had nothing, who was told he was nothing, who became a legend, and who used the legend, in the end, to speak for the men the legend left out. So what do we take from Audie Murphy standing there on that burning tank destroyer in the snow? The easy lesson is the one about courage, that bravery has nothing to do with size or strength or the shape of a man's jaw, that the recruiters who looked at that slight boy and saw someone too small to fight were looking at the wrong thing entirely, that the measure of a soldier is taken somewhere the eye cannot reach. And that is true, and it is worth saying. But there is a deeper lesson underneath it, and it is the one Murphy himself tried to teach the country with the second half of his life. It is that courage has a cost, and the cost does not stop when the battle ends. The same boy who could stand alone on a burning wreck and hold off an army was a boy who had already lost his mother and his father and his childhood, and who would spend the rest of his years unable to sleep for the things he had seen and done. We put medals on the chest, and we tell the story of the hour on the tank destroyer, and we should. But Audie Murphy wanted us to know the rest, that the hero and the haunted man were the same person, that the strength and the wound were, once again, inseparable. The very thing that let him do the awesome impossible at 19 was the thing that never let him fully come home. He fought 2 wars. The first one lasted an afternoon near a village in the snow, and it made him a legend. The second one lasted the rest of his life, and he fought it quietly, in the dark, for himself and for every other soldier who came back carrying it. And that is the war that should make us love him. The first war made him famous. The second one made him human, and it is the one that still has something to teach us. Now I want to hear from you, and this one I think will bring the comments out, because Audie Murphy's story touches something real. Who do you think of when you hear it? A family member who came home from a war changed? Someone whose quiet courage never got a medal? Someone whose invisible wounds were never taken seriously? Tell me in the comments. I read them, and stories like this one belong to more people than just the man in them. If this gave you a fuller picture of Audie Murphy, not just the hero on the tank destroyer, but the whole man, then do me the favor of hitting the like button, because it genuinely helps carry these stories to more people who care about honoring them properly. And if you are not yet subscribed, you will want to be here for the next one, because we are going to tell the story of an entire tank battalion that fought with extraordinary courage under Patton himself, that produced heroes every bit as deserving as any in this war, and that America, to its lasting shame, tried for decades to forget, denying one of its bravest men the highest honor he had earned until almost everyone who could have received it in person was already gone. Subscribe so you are here when we set that record straight. Thanks for watching.